Hello, welcome to Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
We're going to be talking about Host, the Rob Savage film from 2020. You can and should email us at whatthe@scarythoughts.org. We love hearing from you. And for this episode, I'd like to introduce our guest. She is one of the programmers of the Unnamed Footage Festival and a contributor to the website of and frequent guest on the Overlook Hour podcast. This is Madeleine Koestner. Hey, Madeleine.
Hi, so happy to be here.
It's so good to have you. A quick caveat before we go forward. Apologize for the audio quality as we are in COVID lockdown and we're doing this over Zoom, quite appropriately for this film, I think. But we normally do this all in person on very expensive microphones. Anybody got anything to plug right now before we get into the movie? Madeleine, anything going on over there that you want people to know about?
Well, normally I would be promoting the film festival like in full force by now, but considering COVID, it's hard to know when the next edition of the Unnamed Footage Festival will occur. So I don't know, keep an eye on us. It's unnamedfootagefestival.com. We're also on Twitter and Instagram, and listen to the Overlook Hour. I'm a guest on the podcast every once in a while. It's the same group that works on the festival, and they do a really great job. They have chats with indie filmmakers and just go really in depth with horror movies that most film critics and reviewers would just ignore. So yeah, that's all I got.
Fantastic.
Yeah, that's one of my frequent listens is that show. And I went to the Unnamed Footage Festival for the first time last year.
Yeah, I recall chatting with you in the lobby.
Yeah, that's kind of like I don't say it's the most fun part of it, but that's kind of the great thing about it is like all these nerds in one spot, and you get to see the thing and then go in the lobby and talk about it.
Yeah, and it's such a niche event. Just like to give some context, the Unnamed Footage Festival is exclusively in-world camera movies, which is found footage horror, faux documentary, and POV cinema. So any movies made from the point of view of a character. And so everything we show is super niche, super weird, often hard for people to get into. So if someone has shown up to our film festival, you got to guess that you could have a good conversation with them just in having interest in this thing that we're doing.
For sure. And does it take place exclusively in the San Francisco Bay Area, or does it travel in some ways?
Right now, all of our events have been in San Francisco, just in the theaters around San Francisco. We've done some off-festival events, but I would like to one day do something on the East Coast. I actually live in New York, and I just travel out to work with the team. But I would love to have a presence here on the East Coast, considering there really isn't anyone else in the United States doing the kind of thing we're doing. So that's my long-term goal. One day I hope that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be great.
It's very specific.
Yeah.
Well, it's also that thing where it's like really specific, which means there are people who want it in their town so bad, you know?
Yeah. And especially because horror fans do not like found footage horror.
Fools.
It's a genre that gets just, beat up all the time, criticized. Am I allowed to curse on this, by the way?
God, please.
A lot of people think that they're shitty movies. And when they dismiss them just on the genre alone, they don't get to see how creative some of these films are, because it is a limited crew working with very specific technical capabilities and having to create a world that we believe, because suspension of disbelief is the most difficult thing in these movies, because the moment you start saying, well, why is the camera still rolling? Everything breaks. I feel bad because I feel like I'm just getting to the film that we're going to talk about already.
No, absolutely.
But, with the Blair Witch Project, everybody walked into it thinking this is real, at least when it first came out. That was what you were supposed to enter that film with. But now it's been done to death, so everyone is looking for reasons to rip these movies apart when there's some filmmakers who are doing really creative stuff within the genre.
Absolutely. Okay, so before we naturally glide right into the movie itself, I should just say spoilers ahead. Don't listen to this podcast without watching Host first. Go watch it. It's only 57 minutes, or sorry, it's only a 45-minute Zoom call extended into an hour somehow. It's worth it. All right. So do we want to start talking more about in-world camera films, or get straight into this in-world camera film itself?
I think that giving some more background on how we define this subgenre might help people think about Host a little deeper. So just to give the definition of in-world camera, it is a movie in which the camera is an element of the story, as well as the thing that is capturing the images that we're watching. So found footage horror, where you're aware of the filmmaker, you're aware of the camera. Documentary style filmmaking, where, you know, they're presenting something that is supposed to be nonfiction, so you're aware of the crew. And anything where the point of view is from someone's eyes, for example, the film Maniac, the remake with Elijah Wood from 2012, that's a first-person point of view film. Or, and this is actually one of my favorites and something I've been wanting to explore more of, Screen Life, which is essentially a found footage film that is done with a computer screen or an iPhone, for example. And there aren't a lot of these yet, but I think this is an up-and-coming genre with the success of Unfriended and now Host.
In your view, how successful is Host? I sort of feel like it's like the gold record standard of record sales doesn't really mean anything when downloads came along. It just completely flipped even the very idea of buying music. So why do record sales even matter when everybody's streaming? So if we're all locked down and only streaming, understanding the success of a film is a little bit difficult to gauge, not just because there are 0 ticket sales, but because everybody is so glommed onto the memes of the moment, and everybody might watch something and then forget about it 2 days later. And we can call that success, or we can call that something else entirely. Well, what do you think about, is this a successful film in terms of views and its effect on the horror communities?
I mean, from my point of view, that's a yes. Cool. But it's also hard to be sure, considering I'm in a bubble of, you know, people on Twitter, the people I talk to in, you know, whatever Discord server I'm in, but I'm not tapped into the rest of the world right now because of the pandemic. So I can't, you know, go to the office and say, hey, have you heard of this? Because I always use that as a really good gauge of whether or not a movie is like a real success, is did it break out of the horror community? Like, I remember when Midsommar came out, going into the office, and this like older man that I worked with like came over to me and he's like, I saw this movie and you were the only person I think would know anything about it, and it was called Midsommar. And my jaw dropped because I just could not imagine this like white bread dude sitting in a theater and watching Midsommar.
Poor guy.
Man, A24 has some escape velocity, because I was talking to somebody who I would consider just kind of a normie at work the other day, and she is like so into A24 films, like specifically, like it's very weird. Like, and then I've been having more conversations with people who are very aware of that, and part of it has to do with the fact that they do weird shit, like they'll do The Witch and then Uncut Gems, you know. But it's almost like this branded film thing is interesting. But as far as like every single person I've recommended Host to watch it has been kind of a casual fan, and they've all really, really enjoyed it. I think this movie is tremendously successful for this month and next month, and then maybe won't be as consequential later on. But the experience and feeling of watching it right now is really fun.
Yeah, as a quick aside, just talking about gauges at the office, yesterday I was talking to a friend of the Scary Thoughts podcast, Jeremy Lassen, and he was saying he was at work once and there was this big discussion about Nicolas Cage where people were like, yeah, what's he been up to lately? And he's like, the best movies he's ever done in his career. And he realized that there's this amazing litmus test you can do with a group of people, is you go, what's your favorite Nicolas Cage movie? And the difference between people who say Gone in 60 Seconds and Raising Arizona and Mandy are entirely different brands of people, but everybody likes something he's done, right? But you really get a sense of who you're talking to. if all they can talk about is the like shittiest action movies he's done and not the weird fucking shit he's been up to for the last 5 years.
Yeah, and if they're really a member of the cult of Cage, it's Vampire's Kiss.
Word.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Yeah, I think that's a great test, the Cage test,
right?
Just to see how weird you are. And that's a tough one, man. I think my all-time favorite would definitely be Raising Arizona. Like, It's so fucking great. But like, I consider that almost a different Nicolas Cage in the way that I was a different person in high school. Like, so
yeah. But talking about how important, whether that's the word or not, this movie is at this very moment, I think is really key, because there's a way in which, of course, we're all trapped in some capacity, and we're watching a movie about a bunch of people trapped, and we're trapped in front of our laptops and computer screens as possibly the only way we can continue doing work or communicate with anybody other than our partners or roommates. And in a similar way that the people in this film are trapped as their only connection to each other.
Yeah, I was thinking about like the difference in this, like the screen versus like camera thing is really significant for this film, because that view, that zoom view, is only ever for me used for work or really not that fun social engagement. So it's actually the most fun experience I've had looking at a screen with that format, which I was thinking about. And then with like digital cameras and stuff, or like traditional found footage type things, like there's all kinds of different experiences you might have with that style of footage. But this film, it's only ever some buzzkill fucking meeting, you know?
Right. And I've found when I've talked to people about, we're going to cover this movie Host, and I have a lot of friends who have no connection to horror, so they certainly don't have a Shudder subscription or know what I'm talking about. And I describe it briefly. And most people, their first reaction is, you know, like, you want me to watch a Zoom meeting as entertainment? Fuck you, you know?
Yeah.
It was a lot like when Unfriended came out, people were making fun of it just for the concept. Like, everyone was ready for it to be a laugh riot because it was on Skype.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I feel like Host dials up the glitchiness a little bit. Like, I watch this on my laptop screen, like I go to every meeting I do, and like the glitchiness and stuff was fun, but it's also a movie that doesn't suffer for having been seen on a laptop. Like, I've been watching all these classics lately, and I feel super guilty that I'm not watching them on a nice screen. But this movie, no guilt.
Yeah, and I think it's a little bit more like taking in, let's say, YouTube on your laptop or TikTok on your phone or something, where the format really informs how you view it in a way that, movies, generally speaking, are about begging you to watch it in the highest quality possible, right? Like, name a film that isn't sort of reaching for high def in some capacity. I mean, obviously, in the horror genre, there are a lot, but it seems that a movie like this, it's like, well, no, after a certain point, there is no more resolution. There is no more bigger. The soundtrack is only what it is. And I think that that's in world camera films and now with Screen Life, that's a really interesting factor, is that the format that you view it is deeply connected to a new practice of taking in cinema, or an expanded notion of cinema.
So there's two things I want to touch on right now, but the first is this idea of cinema getting higher and higher quality until you're watching it in like the most pristine HD or, an IMAX being projected, and kind of the life of horror in that world. I mean, horror really exploded with the VHS boom. And part of the reason these movies were so scary back then is because they were kind of hard to look at. They were fuzzy and blurry and too dark. And because of that, all these young people's imaginations were running away as they were watching, Nightmare on Elm Street. And when it's obscured, it becomes so much more real because you can't really make sense out of it. So I kind of like watching horror swing from that kind of living on VHS of being this weird fragment captured that like snuck into your nightmares to being this like beautiful HD, like, the French Extreme, like films were so pristine and well shot. And now it's kind of looping back into shooting things in this like pixelated format and like how that scares you in a different way.
That is super interesting, and it kind of makes me think over Host, and there's so much about it I like, and so much about it that I think is like, frankly, just shit filmmaking. And some of its weakest moments are actually when it's crispest. Like some of the special effects or the jump scares are just like the lighting's just a little too good, and you can see the smears of makeup on the zombies or the dead kid's face or something like that. Like, that needed lower resolution in this low res film. Like that was not the moment for sharpness. That was the moment for obfuscation.
Yeah, like
it really undermined the movie.
Is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre scary when it's so clean and like being projected and you can see absolutely everything, because you can see the seams with a lot of these films.
Yeah.
Especially like just that idea that you can't figure out what you're looking at, and that scares you at a more like animal level, where it's like, I don't understand what this thing I'm seeing is because it's too blurry for me to fully take it in, and therefore I can't gauge the threat level.
Yes.
And those are the scarier moments for me, for sure. I think Host has a good combination of both, because sometimes it does get really produced and well lit, and the special effects are a bit too good, and that breaks the movie for me. I actually am less scared during those sequences, and we're going into spoiler territory, so like I'm happy to
all spoilers.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, I think this for me is my argument against most CGI, or when CGI is bad CGI, is you're right to frame it that way, I think. It's not scary if you know what it is, and if you know that it is CGI, it ain't scary. But if it's a weird, mysterious blur in the corner of the screen, that's creepy. There's not much creepy about like someone well lit, covered in gray makeup, taking up the entire screen.
Oh, CGI blood is the fucking worst, man. Like it is like, I mean, how hard is it to have some grip spray some fucking blood from the side? You know, like that shit just infuriates me.
Although I totally agree, except I will say a friend of mine made a movie that was like Tarantino times 10 amount of blood, and it's all CGI blood, but the movie is just a rainstorm of blood from beginning to end, and it's kind of glorious because it's so overblown, it's funny, you know? It's like abject for how absurd it is.
I think if it becomes painterly in the way that like a Japanese sword fighting movie might, you know, or like especially, you know, like which Tarantino borrowed for Kill Bill famously, like that to me, then it becomes like a decision, like, you know, Michelangelo's hands and like the David statue, the hands and feet are kind of big. You know, then it's sort of, it's not naturalistic. It's just like enhanced to give you like more of the point. Like that makes sense. But like for example, the first headshot in The Hunt is just egregious to me. Like just because it's just so obvious. And I don't think a film has to like keep to this like idea of verisimilitude necessarily, but I don't know. Like I think you want to make a good effort at least, you know?
Yeah. Well, again, that to me is about, depending on the kind of film, but for this kind of film, I think you want to keep people in the world of it as much as possible. And obvious CGI is another world, and I think it pulls you out. Not that it's distracting that you're like, oh, that's CGI, but more, oh, that's not something that this laptop picked up.
So the other thing I wanted to bring up is something that I'm really interested in as a film programmer, which is experiential viewing. So basically just watching a movie where there's a second context. Like you have the movie and the story, but there's something outside of the film that's influencing your experience, which is part of why I'm drawn to in-world camera, because already by saying we're trying to show you something and we want you to question whether or not it's real, it's got that second layer to it. And Host is just so timely because we're all spending so much time on our screens. So I like that Shudder was able to put out a movie that gives you that experiential viewing without adding anything other than, you know, the film, because we have the secondary context that we're putting on it in the world we're living in right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess my fear with that is, well, what about when we're not living in the pandemic? Like, will this movie have the same impact once that level is taken out of it?
I would say definitely not. This movie will be incredibly influential, I think. I think people will start playing more with that viewpoint. But I think this movie is probably going to be forgotten in like a year, I would imagine.
Although I suspect, and obviously I don't know, but this filmmaker and several of the actors came together and made a short called Dawn of the Deaf. And it's like a 12-minute zombie hearing impaired short. And it's actually great. It has no conclusion. It feels more like a trailer than a movie. But that paired with this makes me feel that this movie might not necessarily have a life, but it might be a really good launching pad for a lot of the people involved. I think the strongest thing about this movie, outside of just the concept that it resonates, is that the acting is fantastic. I feel like I really scrutinize actors maybe more than I should, especially for a horror fan. And there's not a moment in this film where I felt like people were reading scripted lines so obviously. I felt like everybody was really in it, and I think that makes it carry really well. So I think it makes the fact that the jump scares are super fucking trite and old hat, and a lot of them are like, we've been 15 years into some of these jump scare styles, but the actors are all selling it really well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it passed the stoner test for me. I always watch all these movies like nearly blackout stoned, and like one of the things that I always stands out to me when I'm in that state is really bad acting, because I feel like really bad acting is sort of in the neighborhood of really bad lying. And I think the horror trope of like stoners being able to see through the secret truth of the universe, I think there's some honesty to that. And these actors all pass the kind of like stoner movie test for me. Like they all seem pretty credible in my altered state. And then, the first time I watched it was on my phone, laying in bed, because I was like, I'll watch this now. We'll see how this, before we were going to do an episode about it. And I think it was actually more fun to watch it like that than it was when I watched it the second time on my screen. But I think you're right, Mark. I think this whole crew could have like a total future doing this sort of thing. And then, it's like that Jurassic Park thing, like life finds a way. Like to me, this movie is about like creativity finds a way. Like Hollywood is shut the fuck down right now, yet this happens and it's fun and it's successful.
Yeah, and I think that there's also a level at which, it's not necessarily trying to be great lasting art. It feels more like a carnival ride and not a Disney ride. Not like Tower of Terror where, a year later you can still go, oh my God, the set dressing. But rather a carnival ride where you're like, that was super fun, undeniable. And then you go get some cotton candy,
Yeah, this is the Wizard of horror films.
Totally.
Madeleine, I had a question for you. Like on the Overlook Hours episode about this, you guys talked a little bit about like the problem of a 45-minute event being 60 minutes long, and how like when you're deep into in-world camera stuff, that is irritating, I guess would be a way of putting it. Like, what do you think about that? Like, how important is it to match what's happening, like what's happening in the film to like the experience of watching it?
I mean, for me, I guess it depends on, how you're enjoying the movie, because you can forgive stuff when you really like love everything else that's happening, or if you're so wrapped up in it, you don't notice. So one of the hosts on the Overlook Hour, Russell, he and I talk about, what are the rules of in-world camera quite a bit. And he's normally like really strict about it. Like if there's any, music, it's disqualified. There's just so much that he's very strict about. And when I started pointing out some of the times when host broke its own reality through like, it's supposed to be a 45-minute Zoom call, and the notice that, the call's gone on for 40 minutes comes up after 40 minutes, which that really bothers me. He hadn't even noticed it because he was so wrapped up in, the roller coaster ride of it. But because I wasn't enjoying it as much as he did, I was nitpicking. So if it had met all those, like it would have gotten a few more points for me. But most viewers don't notice that stuff. So I guess that's when you just get really involved in the experiential side of it, I guess. Yeah.
It's also such a specific gag, right? Like I only know about the 45-minute time limit because we use it for this podcast right now, and we reset every 45 minutes. But the other Zoom calls I've done with other friends, they've like shelled out the money for the service or whatever. So I don't experience that cutoff normally. So that gag might not be like a universal experience for people.
Yeah, definitely. But there were a few other things, like front-facing versus back-facing cameras, not being able to tell, are they using a cell phone, an iPad, or a laptop, and what are the rules amongst the different devices, and a whole lot of why is this being filmed right now, which was my biggest issue. It just kept breaking my suspension of disbelief because I simply didn't understand why things were happening on camera.
Yeah, I think that this is something that's baked into the horror genre, is the why don't you just get out of the house? I mean, it's a staple of how do you suspend your disbelief? And I feel like, generally speaking, you can give any movie a couple of things where you're like, okay, that was just a bad judgment call. Okay, you shot the person once and then ran away instead of double tapping to the head when that's how you actually kill people. You can sort of like give a couple of bad choices, but this movie has a lot of them where like yes, the timer, running around your apartment with your laptop mindfully facing so your friends can see what's down the hall.
Perfectly framed.
Perfectly framed. There's also like, go get your dad. Your dad's there. The man who raised and protected you. He's downstairs. Go ask him to like sit with you while this demon's torturing you and your friends. Also the boyfriend, who obviously is dispatched at a certain point. But before that, like, go get your boyfriend. You have like, what's less scary than being alone in a room when being tormented by a demon? Having someone else there to hold your hand. Like, that's pretty basic. It has a lot of those, a lot of weird decision making.
And my big question was, well, why don't they log off? Because it's never tested.
I buy that.
I've been thinking a lot about this.
Yeah.
And
Can we argue with you before you've even said so?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. This is like something that this is the thing I've been like mulling over in my mind the most about this film. And it's like, why not just shut your laptops and get the fuck out of there? Like, break the circle and run. Like, anyone I know who's ever been young enough to, like, if you've played with a Ouija board under the age of 11, you've had that moment where you throw the motherfucker in the box and throw it in the closet, and that's it. Like, nothing else happens. Like, I'm still here. I was not killed by a demon. And I feel like the moment in the film that like allows for the slipperiness of that rule set is when the dude logs back on. And so to me, it's almost like is the call itself is the circle. So as long as the call is existing, the demon is existing. Like that's kind of where I came at to it. So if they had all logged off, it would be done. But as long as a few of them were still maintaining that current, I think that would explain it. Like, I mean, and I've thought about this way too much.
Yeah, it's like kill the psychic, or when Teddy logs back on, have him say something like, "There's weird shit going on," but there's no connection to what's happening outside of the call in a way that makes me believe they simply could just close their computers.
To my mind, I think the thing that kept me in it and not asking that question too much is that the movie is doing the thing that it is. How do I put this? The movie is doing the thing that it's showing, which is that we as viewers, if we're absorbed by it, can't look away, and they also can't look away. So we are all absorbed by the chaos that's happening like a slow car crash, but our friends are in the car. The idea that if we all log off, it might break the circle and dispatch the demon might be in conflict with the only point of contact we have with each other right now is through these fucking Zoom calls, and we're all just like can't look away from the screen and can't shut it off.
So my big issue with that is if I'm watching a movie about something that I'm currently experiencing, like a pandemic and this feeling of being perpetually logged on because it's my only way to communicate with the people I know, the outside world, I need the movie to comment on that at a deeper level. And that would have been the thing that convinced me of it, if that makes sense. There's really no depth to what's going on in Host.
Oh, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yes, I do agree.
You could have definitely made a more important film like this, but I mean, like, I certainly couldn't have, you know. So sometimes it's like, are you looking for, like, I don't know, what's a renowned album, like Radiohead's OK Computer, or like some punk album? That was something you had said on the show, on the Overlook show, that made me think a lot. I was thinking a lot about, like, whether or not it's like a shirking of responsibility to not deliver something like that, or you just did what you could.
Yeah, I mean, they were focused on making a film during a pandemic, not making a film about a pandemic, which is, you know, what I keep saying. And for a lot of people, that's what they want. Sure. I know the rest of the Overlook crew, they all watched it together and they had an absolute blast. But I just was kind of bummed out by it. I feel so much dread logging into these Zoom calls with, you know, my family, for example. My family's been having a weekly Zoom call, and I want nothing to do with it. And I normally wouldn't be, like, talking to them every week. Like, in my normal life, maybe once a month I'll have a nice call with my family, but not every single week. And now they're carving up this time because they know I'm available. And I feel this sense of dread every time I say no to that invitation.
Right.
Yeah. I always call it mandatory fun. Like, mandatory fun is stressful. You know, like when it's like, hey, we're having a happy hour at work, you should come. And you're like, oh, I guess I have to now. You know,
I know
like,
what the word should means.
Yeah.
I think I have a different, along those lines, I have a different thing with this movie that I know it's me. It's not really a criticism of the film. It's just more about something I far prefer text to do for me, that this failed. And that is that the core of this movie, if we take away the whole Zoom framework, is that it is a possession, a haunting. And the relationship that the screenplay has to the occult it borders on zero. It could have been written by someone who knows absolutely nothing about the occult beyond what they might have picked up on a Law and Order episode that they saw 10 years ago or something. There are a couple of catchphrases at the beginning, and then just this demon is unleashed 5 minutes later that murders people. There's just not enough there. Like, you know, and to go on the opposite end, to compare that to something like, what's in the mind of a serial killer? 7. Like, that's how deep you can go with that. How deep can the occult be with people who are practicing it? The Devil Rides Out. Like, that's how far that can fucking go. You know, the devil incarnate on planet Earth, The Witch. Like, these are all stories told by people who have really done their homework and are deeply invested in the evil that they are projecting into their films. And I feel like what is manifested, in The Host is a very willfully ignorant of what's happening in the movie. Does that make sense? Like, there's no depth there.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean,
that's a bummer.
Yeah, you can give me a ghost that's, like, really well researched, or you can give me a ghost that represents something. But they just had a ghost, and that's it. And the reason they had a ghost is because one of them was an asshole. Like, that also really bugs me, that I just don't understand why. I mean, how many Zoom seances do you think are happening? Right. Are there 1,000, and in 999 of them, they're all really nice?
Right.
I don't believe that those events would have conjured a spirit, and then there's no other reason for the spirit.
Yeah. And I am totally on board for not knowing what the fuck is going on, but I don't feel like this was keeping me in the dark. I think that this was an example of there's no there.
Yeah, it gets a D- in metaphysics for sure.
That's yes, thank you. That's it.
But, you know, the other thing that it felt like to me was it felt like the paranormal equivalent of a minimum viable product. Like, just like, let's like ship it, you know, and we'll fix it later or whatever. Like, I could see like Host 2 and Host 3 attempting to fill in the blanks in some ways. I mean, assuming that shit happens or whatever. But, you know, a movie where you just kind of don't really know what the fuck's going on, like Fury Road, right? Like, they're not explaining anything. You don't know anything. But in the background, there's like novel length effort to make the thing. Like it's like a Tarantino movie where he writes like all the history of the sword before you see it on the screen, and none of that shit's ever discussed. But I feel like you can feel that on the screen because the filmmakers make certain choices to keep to their own rules, which add a layer of believability. Whereas if you just go in and go, there's a ghost, it's going to have a mask filter, and it's going to be fucking nuts. Like that, it's not grounded in like a truth that's scary.
I gotta push back on that Fury Road comment.
Whoa.
Because Fury Road, it tells its story and its history through the actual construction of the cars and the way that people look and the way they speak. That is a dense movie, but there's so little dialogue. There's no one telling you the story. Host, the only thing I know about the ghost is that it's a boy and he hung, and that's it. I mean, I don't want to say it's very easy to add characterization, but there's so many methods to do it, and it's very obvious. They put a lot of work into this movie. I just wish that it had been a bit more balanced and not so focused on the technical aspect of it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that brings up an interesting tension that I think exists within horror as a genre that makes it very interesting to me. And Chad and I have talked about this a lot, and I'm sure given the festival that you put together, you can connect with this, but like there's some place between a really high budget horror movie like Hereditary and someone who has $5 and a good idea. And sometimes you want to lean into the $5 and a good idea because you're like, holy shit, they just made it happen somehow. It's the American hardcore comparison, you know? It's not about perfect recordings. It's not about the dexterity of the guitar player. It is about just fucking doing it by any means necessary. And there's a little bit of that to this movie that makes me kind of like it. Like, holy shit, nobody's able to make a movie right now. Well, they fucking did. And it's pretty compelling. But then it's like, yeah, but the places where they really...
They shot themselves in the foot by doing some of it too well.
That's it. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Like they impressed me just enough to disappoint me.
Yeah.
You know what they needed? The movie What We Do in the Shadows, like in the credits, there's a vampire expert. They just needed like a paranormal expert, I think. Like somebody who could have just like tightened that ship up a little bit. Like that's pretty much all this movie needed.
Well, that to me is the game of exposition, right? Like how do you convey enough of the world building to the audience without being ham-fisted about it and without making it just kind of flapping in the breeze?
Yeah.
So I want to bring up Unfriended now, because I think Unfriended solved that problem in a really, really good way, which is it gave the ghost a voice.
I've never seen Unfriended. Can you maybe can you not spoilers describe it enough to follow? So
Unfriended has a kind of similar premise, except it's just like 5 teenagers on a Skype call trying to plan a trip to a music festival when a 6th person logs into the call. Or maybe it's like, the numbers might be off, but that's the premise. And it becomes apparent very quickly that this additional person who they didn't invite, who they can't seem to kick from the call, is supernatural. And it is a movie that it has a lot of depth to it for being just a Skype call. I will even say that the kills in Unfriended are not as well done and over the top as the kills in Host. Unfriended is almost a little simplistic in that way, but what it's saying about, I guess, the millennial experience of being cyberbullied is really what it's talking about through its supernatural element. And it's a success. And it has exactly what Host is lacking for me. It's just like any purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking back to what you said about Fury Road. I think that, like, yeah, you're totally right. Like, I think I definitely used the wrong film for that.
Also, I think maybe you guys thought that I was going to say Fury Road wasn't one of the greatest films ever made for a second.
Oh, no.
We don't tolerate that kind of talk around here.
Also, I've talked to you enough I think in our brief exchanges to know that would probably not be the case.
It's a 5 out of 5. No worries.
Yeah, but what I wanted to mention was that like the storytelling like with objects is so good with that movie, and it's things you don't even see. Like I just went a couple months ago, like around Christmas, I went to the Peterson Museum for their like sci-fi fantasy movie car exhibit, and they have a few cars from Fury Road there, and you can get pretty close to them and look in. The amount of shit that is in Nux's car that tells his story that you would never see on screen, but the actor must have just felt is incredible. Like one of the coolest things is there's like, I mean, you have to be really fucking a specific person for this, but he has like a bunch of spark plugs hanging in like a container with like toothbrushes next to it. And if you've ever had to deal with an old fucking car that had shitty like oil covered like engine parts, like you have to like do that like toothbrush to your spark plug. It's just such a cool, irritating thing to have brought into a thing, and you just don't ever see it on the film. You don't see that. The car never stalls. Nobody has to change a spark plug, but it's there. It's so cool.
Yeah.
I don't think this movie has any of that.
No. And, of course, less the first time, certainly the second time I watched it. The first time you watch it because it's sort of Paranormal Activity-ish. I don't know about you, but I was watching the background more than the foreground. Like I was sometimes paying attention to what's down the hall before anything even got scary, because I just wanted to see, oh, did they do something clever, like someone's foot is in the hallway or someone's back there watching but you can barely see. And there was none of that. There was no extra. Well, there was things, none of that was subtle. Everything was very overt. There was either totally a hanging body or not a hanging body, but there also wasn't any I couldn't find any like foreshadowing or something out of place. But again, like you do what you can in the circumstances. But that leads me to a question I had, Madeleine. Watching all of these in-world camera movies, I've watched a bunch, certainly not as many as you, but definitely in this movie I saw a lot of what I would think of as cliches of the genre. Especially in the horror end of in-world camera. And do all of these films unroll pretty much the same stuff? Or is it like any kind of horror movie? It's like, yeah, a jump scare is a jump scare.
I would say a host definitely does some of the things that you are like looking for when you start watching a found footage horror or a Paranormal Activity, considering there's so many. And it does them really well. It's got a really great, drag out of the room, which is like a motif in the Paranormal Activity series.
Yep.
And it does a lot of body drops, which is another like big one where, the camera falls.
Yep.
It does them really well, but it doesn't do them differently. It doesn't really break the mold for any of these things. And in my opinion, it overdoes them a few too many times. They use the same effect over and over again. And so the first time I see that effect, I'm really impressed because they constructed it really well and they choreographed it really well. But then the second time I see it, I kind of, I'm not that interested anymore. I'm like, do something else. I really appreciate that it is a barrage of stuff. Like the last half of Host is nonstop. And you don't get that very often in like these little horror movies. You normally get like a handful of things, but they're spread out. They're real set pieces. Host is like bang, 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 bang.
It's true. And I think that one thing that because of the format of it being a Zoom call that it affords is that if there are two separate scenes in a horror movie and it's jumping between them, you sort of have to play both of them out in a certain way. Like these two people are in a forest. These two people are in a living room. The people in the forest are being chased by this. The people in the living room are confronting that. You have to follow them sort of separately. And if you cut back and forth, it's very awkward. Whereas because this is a Zoom call, they're all separated, but they're bound by the Zoom call. So when shit really kicks off in this movie and there are multiple things happening at the same time, it's like it's all happening in one room, but it's actually happening in two completely separate spaces. And they're happening in two completely different ways. And I thought that was really really confusing in an amazing way, because it was hard to follow, but it's not because the movie was being chaotic. It's because there was shit happening everywhere.
I have a question for you guys. Did you get a sense of, I guess the director, did you get a sense of the individual who was kind of controlling it, or did you feel that the one character who was the host of the call was, it was her computer screen?
I just kind of let go of that question, I think. I think very early on, I became aware that the focus of what we were seeing in the frame was not consistent with a Zoom call.
Mm-hmm.
And I just sort of just let it be okay.
Yeah, it gave it this real surveillance feeling for me, that like there was another person's presence in the movie, in the storytelling, because it just felt like when things happened on the screen, I didn't believe that character was the one, moving the mouse or shifting things, adding people to the call, just because the timing seemed a little weird.
Well, what's his name? The guy who logs off almost immediately seems to be able to log back onto the call with anybody readmitting them, which is that a thing? Can you do that on Zoom? Can you invite yourself back on, or do you have to be you have to be readmitted, right?
You have to be readmitted.
So then maybe the demon is readmitting him, but the demon can also make Zoom last 10 minutes longer?
See, that's actually, honestly, I hate playing that game where it's like, well,
totally.
this is how I would have done it if I did the movie, because that is just, it's trite. But
for sure.
But that's really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a point at which the demon kind of reveals itself as the one controlling everything that's going on, because that ties everything together for me. Like, why is this being filmed? Why are they still on the call? Why are people joining and leaving and rejoining? And why is everybody still logged on when there's no one there and there's only one character left, and she's left her home and gone to another character's home? The perspective gets so jumbled in the last third that I was just wondering, like, well, whose computer screen am I even watching? And I feel like it's the filmmaker.
I kind of agree with that. I feel like the filmmaker or maybe like you as a meta viewer, because I've definitely logged on to work calls where I don't say shit and it felt just like that. You know what I mean? I'm just there. I'm one of 80 people listening to something. And it doesn't really do any sort of work to make the viewer part of the film, like some sort of goofy jump scare where it shows like behind POV of you, you know what I mean? Like some sort of like weird camera trickery to make you feel like you were part of the story, like Mouth of Madness or something like that. But it felt to me like it was trying to like ease you into some sort of like non-critical, you're watching it with them kind of vibe.
Yeah. The one time that I think that does not hold up a litmus test of believability, but I am totally on board and don't give a fuck, is the I don't know the names of any of the characters, but the one who had the looping background and it was interspersed with her smashing her head against the keyboard. To me, that was the centerpiece of the movie.
Gemma, but I'm not totally sure.
Could be, yeah.
That was definitely the most creative.
Fucking awesome.
Yeah.
Really unique death.
It freaked me out when it first happened.
Yeah.
When something broke through the background.
To me, that was a use of the medium perfectly.
Yeah, definitely.
What are the restrictions of this format? There, break them and kill someone off with them. Gorgeous.
Yeah. I liked that, and I liked the selfie stick a lot. Both of those really impressed me.
Right.
Yeah. The floating face was kind of interesting too.
That's cute.
Like,
it's a little too silly looking. It made me laugh.
I was thinking about, like, for me, I was like, oh, well, those filters are stupid, and it is kind of stupid. Like, it's almost like, yeah, it is stupid, but it's being used in a horrifying way. Which to me, if it was gonna I guess you could dig in there and try to like have some sort of commentary about like the horror of covering your face with a filter or whatever. But I think it was the one thing that really gave a sense of like dimensionality in a scene, which I just was thinking about, like, yeah, is that person seeing something there? I guess she's not, because she sees she throws the flower to try and see if there's anything there, which is like a total Scooby-Doo move. Yeah, the face smashing screen though, like that is like a legitimately good. Like, if you were going to do a best scares of the year, that's for sure going to be on that list.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think, speaking of cliches of the genre, the thing that bothered me tremendously is something that happens at the very end of cliched horror movies. like Sinister did it, but it seems it's how Paranormal Activity ended, which is the very last thing we see is the monster eating the camera. You know, it's so boring. It's so I
There's got to be a
remember.
name for it.
Oh, well, it's not the name for it, but I remember a friend of mine who lives in LA was telling me about how opens his mouth more than humanly possible is a phrase in horror screenplays that is like, you just cut and paste that in. There was like a 10-year period where that's just like, every movie has to have it. So you just like, and opens his mouth more than humanly possible. And it's like, yeah, for like 10 years, every movie did that. And the in-world camera thing. So the monster has to jump at the camera.
It's the I don't know how to it's I don't know how to end the sketch, you know?
Totally. It's the and scene of first person camera. Yeah. It's too bad because it really undid all the work that they built up with trying to create that world.
It feels like such a studio note, that ending.
It
but
does.
You know that there was no studio saying, add that on. So it's we've seen it before and it's in our heads, so we're gonna do the thing.
Yeah,
you can see some producer being like, and at the end, bada boom, bada bing, the monster. Like, it's like, okay, buddy. But the best open mouth, bigger than normal scene of all time is the dentist scene in Coneheads, I think.
I don't even remember that. I would say the "Come to Daddy" video by Aphex Twin, but
oh, pretty solid, yeah.
I like Taking a Deborah Logan. If you've seen it, I mean, that's like the image of the film, and it is also the climax of the film. But,
right.
Yeah, but it's not that I'm taking it a little further than what the thing actually is, because
right. I want to go back, if we could, speaking a little bit again about format. Chad, you had in a message articulated something you and I talk about a lot, is this idea of like in horror films now, like how do you get rid of the cell phones? You got to confront that. Friday the 13th didn't have to deal with no reception. Now every movie has to deal with whether or not everybody's phone has reception. It's just it's like an obstacle. And that this movie sort of, how did you put it? Sidesteps it or embraces it fully, or it's the opposite?
Man, you're asking a lot for me to remember anything. I texted late night.
Okay, pretend I just brought this up out of the blue then.
I think part of, for me, what it was like, everybody just dispenses with the technology. Like that's kind of like, oh, no reception, or like, oh, there's a, EMP blast or whatever nonsense they have. And I'd like to think that this movie might open doors a little bit for people to think about like, okay, how does this supernatural creature or this conspiracy or whatever, how does it interact with the technology rather than dispensing it? Because, technology is so thoroughly ubiquitous. It's like almost like saying like, well, we're just going to have a movie where we don't think about, electricity. Like it's you can't just turn it off. Like it's here. It's not going to go anywhere. And it's even past the point of critique in some ways. Silicon Valley won. So I hope this movie and movies like it might encourage people to bring in gags and ideas using interconnectivity through mobile devices. Because for the most part, people just kind of avoid it. And I think that might be a symptom of a lot of these films being made by Gen X and older people. So I think as younger filmmakers come online, we're going to see a lot more interesting ideas like that.
Well, the turn in horror where technology became often the source of the fear was that like Asian horror boom when Ring came out and Pulse and all of that, because these were films that really, the fear was coming from the technology and that like interconnectedness of it. And so I kind of see movies like Host and Unfriended as influenced by Asian cinema in that sense. And like, I really like that. I like modernizing things, but it's also horror has waves to it. And a lot of people are still stuck in the slasher wave where everything is just Friday the 13th to them. And that's when you wind up with the cell phone issue, the service issue. When people are still trying to tell the same stories that were being told in the 70s and the 80s. But now we're not in that time anymore, and the world has changed, and our idea of what a horror movie is needs to change. And so I like seeing movies being made like Host for that exact reason. They're adapting to a different world.
Oh, for sure. I think one way in which that's true for how I view these things is that a lot of them end up, certainly, in World and now with Screen Life, they invert cinematography because our language of cinema is, for the last 100 years, has been about coverage and editing and camera movement. But Host is entirely about the static shot. When it moves, it's like you get whiplash because the cameras are so static, and it really amps up the chaos of the violence. But this style of filmmaking really calls into question how cinematography is supposed to function. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, a lot of the number one complaint we get from people is that people get motion sickness watching like found footage horror.
Right.
I hear it all the time. But
I can also see nausea from the stasis of the camera. That to me is part of one of the interesting things about Host is there is a tension in being stuck with a static frame.
Yeah. If I can go back to talk about Pulse again and any of the Kurosawa, his films, he does a lot of work with static shots and empty space becoming sort of like almost like portals of dread, where you've got a shot that's just a little too wide and the action is happening just in a corner and there isn't anything in the rest of the frame, but it's a little too dark and it's a little too grimy looking, and all of a sudden that space becomes suffocating and terrifying, and there's nothing in it and nothing happens, but the space creates a feeling.
Yep.
And I really like when things play with that. I don't know how intentional Host is with, holding on an empty room after a character has been killed, holding on a shot where you can see just a bit of blood. I'm not sure if they're doing it with artistry or they're doing it because, well, we have to make this shot from a laptop and no one's there to turn off the laptop.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting component. Is it's one thing to have a cinematographer hold a shot too long. It's another thing where you're trapped with the camera being trapped and the frame can't move because it's a laptop, and so you're stuck. Like, obviously it's all about choices. The filmmaking is about choices, but there's a little bit more of a feeling of no choice with a laptop that can't be shut off than there is with, say, a filmmaker pointing a camera for too long.
Yeah, and
which
also,
obviously this is. It's just baked in. Sorry.
Yeah, and a lot of those moments are really just cueing you to brace yourself for the jump scare.
Yeah. True.
And for a lot of people, living in that space is really upsetting. A lot of people watch horror movies and the thing that they are afraid of is the feeling of being scared, of being startled. And so the dread they are experiencing is more linked to waiting for the feeling and hating the wait. I'm more drawn to psychological horror. Like, I really want ideas to be the scary thing. Like, I want it to present me with an idea that, plants itself in my brain and then like keeps me up at night because I can't stop thinking about something happening. But Host is entirely contained to the movie.
It does not ask questions.
Yeah.
For you to mull over. Well, other than the ones, we're sort of mulling over that it implies by format, but not by form.
Yes, definitely. And a lot of people keep talking about how scary it is. I just didn't see it being scarier than just some jump scares.
Right. It's scary, but not dreadful, I think.
Yeah.
We need to start pushing the term jump scary, to like distinguish it from being scary, just because it's like, hey, it's jump scary. It's not, like, because there's things that'll shock you in the way that if I walk up behind you and like drop a piece of ice down your back or something, some goofy thing. Like it's more pranky than anything like that.
No, totally. We keep bringing up like Paranormal Activity, or maybe I keep bringing up Paranormal Activity as a point of reference, but like that movie scared the shit out of me. But the second the credits rolled, I was like, that was actually a terrible movie.
Yeah.
And I didn't think about it ever again, except that it had me wrapped around its finger because of low droning sine waves and jump scares.
Yeah. I will definitely say Host is an exercise in good jump scares, and proving that like just having jump scares is not bad. It's simply a way of scaring people. It can be done really well, and I think Host did it really well.
What was the name of that film that opened the Unnamed Footage Fest this year? It was the opening night.
Oh, that would have been the Fear Footage. We did a double feature of the Fear Footage 1 and 2. And we love those movies, but they're goofy.
Well, what I was about to say though is I've talked about this film several times just because I was so like unexpectedly impressed by it. Yeah. It has really credible jump scares, which to me like sort of implies this idea that like the creation of a jump scare is its own unique little internal art within the piece. It's almost like if you made like a sculpture and then somebody designed the rings on the sculpture separately or something like that. It like if it was like a human figure or something like that. Like it. So there's definitely like a skill to the jump scare, and you got to kind of give a nod to like that stuff when it happens, because it is, because I don't get scared by horror movies at all. Like I've never found, even as a child, they're just not scary to me. And the only thing that'll get me is like a really well done jump scare every once in a while.
Yeah, I remember there was like a talk I attended once, and they did a dissection of one of the scares from Jaws. And sort of they're scuba diving through like a sunken boat, and a head floats into the frame. Yep. Do you know the scare I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and dissecting that almost frame by frame to show how well crafted that scare is and like why it's so effective. And I think finding really good jump scares and then looking at them through that like just super close microscope, it's a fun exercise to be like, how did this scare me?
Totally. I think it's similar to thinking about the Brahm, the 40 tubas playing into a grand piano thing that we've had since the, was it the Inception preview that did it for the first time?
Oh, it was definitely in that. Yeah.
Hans Zimmer, yeah. That now is in every preview and every Marvel film and. But like, it's kind of worth dissecting what the fuck's happening. It's actually kind of interesting whether you're annoyed by it or not.
Well, it's having an effect, and to me, like anything that has an effect on a broad group of people is pretty interesting to think about, because you get into the idea of techniques of mass psychology and crowd control and things like that. Like, it's like if this thing works on a lot of people and you understand it, you might be able to affect a lot of people with an idea, which is a pretty powerful tool to have.
Yeah. I have a question for you both. If you were to make a better, to your mind, better Zoom-based horror movie constructed strictly on that platform, what would it be?
That's such a hard question.
I'd imagine it's harder for you than us because you think about this shit more than we do.
I'm not prepared. All right. Have Chad answer, and then I'll come up with something.
Chad, go.
All right, I'll go, because you had texted me something similar to this earlier, so I've had a moment to think about it. So I don't know that I'm going to necessarily out the gate come up with like a great cool format or anything innovative with the screens. But what I was thinking was that like the type of, like, I guess, villain you might introduce, you could introduce some sort of like abusive boss character and really experiment with the feeling of being like shit on or bullied or terrified in some way through the screen, where it's like this idea of non-proximate physical danger or something like that. Like I imagine, like, if my boss fired me through a Zoom call, it would be fucking gnarly as if I was sitting next to him, like, so there's the potential of like that sort of thing. Like, so some sort of authoritative punishing villain, I think, would be an opportunity.
Yeah. Should I go?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. I was thinking about some sort of like David Fincher-like movie, entirely constructed of a series of Zoom calls that are about being canceled. So like cancel culture has been very much on my mind for very unfortunate reasons in my community lately. And I think it could be really interesting. A series of Zoom calls that are opening up and unraveling a collective conspiracy using the online world as the framing device and the format of a person sort of like discovering what the fuck is going on out there, because, cancel culture is an online phenomenon. And so to watch it happen online, but as a movie, if there was a movie about being canceled, it's this thing happening online, but you'd have a bunch of people talking to each other in person. But here it would be, of course, using the format of it being online as well. So discovering lies being told and truths being manipulated, and like you were saying, getting fired, losing friends, contacting a lawyer, etc.
What is that film where it's basically the woman made a movie, but then she didn't really release it or ever really make it, but she has a presentation where she talks about how she made the movie?
My first film, Zia
Yes, yes. Like I could see like using some of her techniques a little bit like that, like a person unraveling like how they came to be pushed out of a community.
Right. Like it probably almost feel like a police procedural, but the cop is the person.
Yeah, you're the victim and the cop.
Yeah.
I think I definitely would want to do a Death Game style Zoom film.
Oh, what a good idea.
I'm sorry, what is that? What's a Death Game? What do you mean?
So a Death Game is a story in which you have to participate in something that is game-esque, but if you lose, you die.
That's terrible.
It's like my favorite subgenre.
I knew exactly what you're talking about, but I'm trying to think of like an example.
I mean, it's
what was
Battle
the
Royale.
really big one from? Oh
Yeah.
There was also a mobile phone based one that came out like 4 years ago.
I know it's Nerve, right?
Nerve, that's it. That's the one. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but like imagine Nerve, except the entire thing is the videos they were making instead of.
That's
like
great.
So it's told through the phones instead of through outside.
Yes.
I mean, I really do like the idea of setting a movie like this in a pandemic, but make me feel the pandemic.
Well, we're all just trying to feel something. We're all just numb and looking for something to do. I guess like a very elaborate Russian roulette is as good as anything.
Yeah.
Shit. What else do we have for host?
I mean, that's pretty much what I got. I mean, I would say go watch it. It's fun. Watch it now before you get out of lockdown and it won't feel as cool.
Yeah, it's a little bit like, in that way, it's a little bit like, oh my God, have you binged? Blah. It's like, well, if you don't binge it now and get excited with your friend, it might not be worth doing in a year. Because a lot of oftentimes bingeable means like disposable, which is fine.
Madeleine, what do you think the most successful in-world camera film is? Like the one that you're just like, man, this shit rules. And you would use it as the example of it.
Oh, I mean, I guess that depends on what you're really looking for. Like, do you want incredibly mean?
Always.
Yes, always. Yeah.
We showed a movie. We showed a movie at the festival. I think it was year one, called My European Vacation Descent into Darkness, I think is the full title. And that is one of the most successful movies, just in the way that you watch a character unravel, and it gets very grim. It is really upsetting. I think a friend of mine who, we met through like wrestling and punk music, and we're really into horror, and he walked out of that and he was like, that was too much. So I always recommend that if you're like, do you want to get as depraved as possible? But honestly, I love Unfriended. I think Unfriended is such a good use of the medium, and the fact that it's shot in real time and that it's using young people and creating their world. But then I would never recommend Unfriended to dark web for all the reasons I think Unfriended is a success. Unfriended 2 is a massive failure. It's like some boomer idea of what the dark web is.
Oh, Jesus.
It just falls flat on its face. But yeah, like I honestly, I recommend Cloverfield a lot too, for people who need something more produced with a bigger budget that's a little easier to watch. There's so many of these movies, and they're not really bound by horror. And we try to reflect that in the festival. We try to find comedies that are made this way, science fiction films. There's this awesome sci-fi film called The Triangle that is a documentary crew goes to this commune out in the desert. It's a group of basically hippies who want to live like they're at Burning Man year round. but then something strange starts happening in the desert. And it's not a horror film, it is a science fiction film, and it is so cool. So it's hard for me to recommend something because I gotta know what he's shopping for.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so obvious to refer to the Blair Witch for obvious reasons, but I feel like there are only these very rare singular moments in film where people don't know what's happening, where like you only get one War of the Worlds, you only get one Blair Witch. And I'd be very curious when that happens again, right? I mean, this happens in music with fake artists. This happens in visual art when people sham the art world, where there's some sort of very elaborate lie that is tied to what the thing actually is. And I'll be curious where this can go next. Like, I wonder if in camera it can only reproduce the idea, but can't be the thing ever again. Because, you know, the first time I heard about Blair Witch, my friend saw it at a screening where at a university before it was released, where no one was told what it was. They were just like, hey, there's a movie in the theater. And people went and people were like screaming and freaking out, losing their shit, running out of the theater. Like, you know,
Dude,
this wasn't in the 20s. This just happened.
That shit was so crazy. I worked in a little indie film theater when that movie came out, and then we got like a really, really early screener of it, like a couple weeks early, because the local film reviewer he liked to watch shit at our theater, so we would get it, and we would always watch whatever came early, you know, because we could. And we all went into it pretty cold and watched it, and we're like, no one who saw it thought anything of it. We're like, this is fucking stupid. And then like once like the marketing campaign started going and stuff, like people would run the fuck out the theater. Like it happened a few times. Like people were like, I just can't take it. And they would leave and get their money back and go. And I'd never seen a film like that before. And I was like, man, how is this like group of people completely unaffected by this film? And then like these randos off the street are like terrified by it. And I feel like it had a little bit to, or not a little bit, but a lot to do with the marketing.
Absolutely. Well, but it's always marketing, right? It's almost like anti-marketing. I mean, I think that the only other thing I can think of right now that is close is something like a discussion about QAnon, or like how is someone creating elaborate lies that people can't distinguish? Like in that circumstance, obviously, we're not talking about something framed as art by anybody, really.
Yeah.
But it's a similar sort of gesture. Like, well, what are examples of people collectively being shammed and misled by invention?
I don't think that this phenomenon can happen again in the world of filmmaking.
Yeah.
At least like something that is branded a movie.
Yeah.
I think people are too tech savvy now. They know too much about the behind the scenes for something to sneak up on us again.
Right.
But there's all these new channels for making stories. It's like in like looking at like new media, and there's a whole genre of these cell phone videos that are text chats happening between two people that like tell a story, and you watch it like a video on your phone, but it really is just text messages. And I think that the next thing that really scares people in the way that the Blair Witch did is going to have to come in a format like that. Something that's so casual and everyday that it catches people off guard and is being delivered in a way where you can't immediately recognize it as a work of art.
I feel like that's slightly happening on YouTube.
Yeah.
With like little homemade documentaries or first person narratives, you know, using not YouTube as a filmic platform, but YouTube as the platform that it seems to be most adept at being.
I've been very fascinated in alternate reality games, if you've ever heard of that.
No, what does that mean?
It's basically a game you sign up for that messes with your sense of reality. So like you could find a link to a website that's embedded in, you know, the coding of an image, and you go to the website and you put your phone number in, and then you get a phone call from somebody who's telling you you're involved in a conspiracy or gives you a job interview or something like that. And they give you like a login and you go somewhere and you log in. And it's a story that unravels within a person's own reality, but it's all fake.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, it sounds like sort of somewhere between an escape room and like murder dinner theater or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a really fascinating method of storytelling, but it's so elaborate and hard to do. And right now, a lot of it is like coding. You'll find a lot of like, decoding stuff that's found in HTML, et cetera.
Oh.
So I'm curious to see sort of how that breaks into bigger world like events.
Oh, that's cool. So what have we learned?
Zoom is scary.
It is. I mean, I've got a family call right after this.
Oh, yeah. I said I didn't want to talk to my family earlier in this. I love my family.
Yeah. I will say what I've learned just from life is Zoom is only fun if you have Slack and you can be chatting with a fellow snarker on the side about what's happening. Like that's really the most fun part. Like you get to kind of MST3K your own company meeting.
Oh my God, that's great. All right, is that it?
That's all I got.
Yeah, me too.
Awesome. Well, Madeleine, thanks so much for joining us. That was great. I'm glad we could make that work. You were like exactly the perfect person to talk to about this movie.
I know. Yeah. I was so bummed at first. I was like, yeah, we're going to go forward. And it's just going to be me and Mark talking about like what we like, and it's not going to have the context of the festival and like the deep knowledge of the genre and stuff. So I'm really glad it worked out.
I'm going to plug the Overlook Hour once more. It is one of my favorite podcasts, and I just happen to be friends with them. They say it's a horror show, but they barely talk about horror movies. So.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that's so enjoyable about it is like I'm friends with some guys that do a similar show called Popcorn, Piss and Vinegar. And they're guys I went to high school with. And the thing I love about the Overlook Hour is it's like hanging out with the fucking mutants you worked with in the 90s. Like that's exactly what it's like.
Mm-hmm.
If you had a bunch of weirdo friends that were mostly united by your interest in like a couple bizarre ass things, but you're totally different, but loving this dumb shit is so unifying in a way that a lot of other cultural touch points aren't. So you get to feel this really honest, fun connection with people that's agendaless and unmoored and fun,
Totally. All right. Thanks for listening.
What do you mean by you did wrestling?